Great. The numbers seem to have stabilized, so I'll make a start. Thank you for joining us, as I say, this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Marcus Manafo, and I'm here representing the UK Reproducibility Network. I'm joined by three colleagues, Ruth Davis, Alice Howarth, and Richard Jackson, all of whom are involved in the project that we will be talking about. The focus of this afternoon's webinar is on evaluating interventions designed to increase the uptake of open research, and in a moment I will share my slides and take you through what we're doing as part of the UK Reproducibility Network's Open Research Programme. I'm planning to talk for about half an hour, and then after that there will be a brief session run by Ruth where we will try and solicit feedback from yourselves in terms of what we're doing and where we might improve aspects of that, because we're still at a stage of the project where we can take that feedback into account. And then we will have a Q&A session. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, then please do put those into the Q&A box that will appear. And my colleagues may answer some of those questions as we go along in the chat, and those that we don't answer in the chat, we will come to at the end of the session. And if there are further questions at that point, then either put the questions into the Q&A or you can, I think, raise your hand. I'm not sure what functionality has been enabled, but either way, you will be able to get your questions to us, and the person who is best suited to answer that question will do so, because the four of us that are here representing the project all bring slightly different things to it. So hopefully that's all clear, and with that, I'll move straight to the presentation. So what I'm going to do is very briefly introduce the motivation behind the UK's Open Research Programme and outline what that is. And then I'll talk in a little bit more detail about how we plan to evaluate that programme and the methods that we will use to determine not just whether or not the programme has had an impact on the uptake of open research practices, but also how we can dissect the elements of the intervention, if you like, the active ingredients that are having an effect if we do see an effect. So the background to this, and I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with this, is that there is now, I think, broad consensus that it is at least worth reflecting on how we can improve the quality of the research that we produce, and that current incentive structures and ways of working are perhaps not optimal in terms of delivering robust findings that advance knowledge, benefit society, and so on. And as the UK Reproducibility Network, we very much focus on the research process and draw where we can on lessons from other sectors, other industries. For example, automobile manufacturing learned a great deal in the 1970s through the insights of the statistician W. Edwards Deming about the value of quality control checks throughout a manufacturing process, in this case, which transformed the reliability of automobiles. All automobile manufacturers now use a variant of that process, as do other manufacturers. And the analogy, if it holds, is that by focusing our quality control checks not only on the end product, the journal article, but also on the research process, the practice of conducting research, the study protocol, the data, the code, and so on, then we can drive up the quality of the end product and also improve productivity in the sense of more rapidly advancing knowledge and benefiting society. And the complexity of the challenge was captured in this paper that we published a few years ago now, that underpinned some of that philosophy of the UK Reproducibility Network that I mentioned. It highlights the number of stakeholders in the research ecosystem that need to bring to bear the levers available to them in a coordinated fashion to achieve the kind of change that we are aspiring to. So this means researchers themselves, but also institutions, publishers, funders, and so on, to address the various threats to the research cycle. And one area that I think is worthy of attention is open research, transparency in research, because that is one where all of those different elements of the research ecosystem, including researchers themselves, have a direct role to play. And in fact, it's one of the few where researchers themselves can simply elect to work in a particular way. But of course, we need to create the incentives that make that an attractive option for researchers, rather than something that is simply done by those with the strongest personal belief in that approach. So if you're interested in finding out more about the UK Reproducibility Network, you can find our website there, and we're also on X, formerly known as Twitter. And we work by establishing a structure that allows for the coordination of different elements of the research system. We have local networks, communities of practice that are researchers now at something like 70 universities across the UK. And that brings together researchers on the shop floor, so to speak, on the ground. We have institutional members with a senior academic focused on research improvement at that institution, working at the senior management level on training and incentives. And we have those at about 40 institutions. The model is that ideally every institution would have both that grassroots representative and that person holding senior management's feet to the fire. And then we have a group of funders, publishers, learning societies, what we call our stakeholder engagement group. And through that structure, we can coordinate within and between those different elements. And that is integral to the Open Research Programme that I'll introduce in a moment. And in fact, that same basic model, that structure, has been adopted by a number of other countries. And so we're seeing a range of reproducibility networks emerge in other countries, particularly in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. And one of the challenges is identifying the right level of abstraction for that kind of coordination effort. We have one country, Luxembourg, that only has a single university, so they have a network of one. But we also have a regional network in Africa, where many countries in Africa individually lack the critical mass to form a reproducibility network. So the appropriate level of abstraction there is at the regional level. But this is also allowing us to coordinate what we do at a supranational, at a global level. And although what I'll be talking about today is very much focused on the UK context and the UK reproducibility network, the hope is that these ways of working and these lessons that we learned from this initial project can then be extended to other countries with tweaks, adaptations to fit that national context. In terms of our vision and purpose, this is what you can find on our website: for the UK system to be outstanding in conducting and promoting rigorous and transparent research, and in particular, for that research to be rigorous, reproducible, and transparent. And we attempt to do that in a way that is relevant across different disciplines. That's one of the, I think, quite exciting challenges about what we're trying to do, finding a model of open research that is relevant in the physical sciences, in the life sciences, in the social sciences, even in the arts and humanities, where what data looks like will be very different, and what constitutes reproducibility will be understood differently, but where we can use transparency as a model that allows for the research process to be laid bare, interrogated, scrutinized, critiqued in a way that means that someone with appropriate knowledge could look at that research process, recreate or reproduce the decisions and choices that were made through that research process, and then decide whether or not they agree with them, would have made different choices, and therefore would have reached similar or different conclusions. Our Open Research Programme is our flagship project at the moment. So we have UKRN as a structure that allows for that coordination and collaboration across those three major groups. And this is a project that was funded by Research England, one of our major government funders in the UK, a few years ago, and will run for another few years. And it has a number of institutions as partners on that project that are shown here, and also a number of partners from other parts of the research system, publishers, UK-based centres of expertise, and international centres of expertise. And so what we're trying to do is bring about a step change in the extent to which open research practices are embedded within business as usual, both on the part of researchers themselves across disciplines and on the part of institutions. And the project itself leans on that structure that I mentioned earlier, with input from institutional leads at participating institutions. So all of those institutions that I mentioned are members of the UK Reproducibility Network, but not all members of the UK Reproducibility Network, institutional members, are currently part of the Open Research Programme. Most are, but a few are not. And then on the ground, with input from our local networks, we have open research coordinators and administrators, what we call ORCAs. And along the bottom, you can see the 5 major elements of the project. One is management and sustainability, which provides the oversight for the whole project and looks at how we can make sure that what we deliver and learn through this project carries on beyond the lifetime of the funded part of the project and becomes business as usual within our institutions. In terms of the actual intervention, there are 3 parts: training, sharing and integrating what we learn from that, and then reward and recognition, the incentives that will drive the uptake of these open research practices that we will provide training in. And I'll give a little bit more detail on the nature of the intervention and those component parts in a moment. And then, of course, we have the evaluation project, which is what we will be focusing on today, which is how we determine whether or not this intervention has in fact made a difference in open research practice, which is challenging against a background of a lot else happening across the sector, nationally and supranationally, particularly around open research, and the lack of an experimental design, which simply isn't feasible for a project on this scale across so many partner institutions. And at the end, I'll talk about the statistical methods that we will use to try and understand both whether or not the intervention has had an impact, but in particular, if so, how, through these different active ingredients. So at the moment, we have 24 institutions and more are joining all the time. That's another challenge in terms of evaluation, that the sample size, if you like, is a moving target. And the aim is to build capacity at the researcher level, the institutional level, and the sectoral level. And the three elements that I will be talking about are the skills element, the train the trainer courses that we are offering to upskill researchers and enable the implementation of open research practices in that way by a broader community than is currently engaged in those practices. And then incentives at the institutional level so that there is reward and recognition for engaging in those open research practices. And then in terms of insight, monitoring the extent to which that changes over time. So the hope is that we will train at least 180 trainers in a broad range of open research practices, and through that develop a community of practice of those trainers across multiple institutions who can then work in a mutually supporting way to deliver training both within their institutions, but also potentially across their institutions. And at the heart of this is the trainer program that we have just launched, which allows institutions to send individuals from their institutions, researchers across career stages, members of professional services staff, librarians, technicians, and so on, anyone engaged in the research process, onto these train the trainer courses. Those individuals need to have some understanding of the open research practices that they will be engaging in, because they will then go back and deliver training in workshops locally within their institution, tailored to their audience. But critically, through this train the trainer model, we're hoping to embed a degree of interoperability in how open research practices are engaged in, so that through that collaborative network, researchers trained at Bristol, my own institution, for example, will be trained in broadly the same way as researchers at Liverpool or King's College London, the other institutions that are part of the program, so that when researchers move from one institution to another, the training that they have been given remains relevant, and also the incentives that exist at those different institutions in terms of hiring and promotion criteria, for example, also remain consistent. And we're trying to build that sense of community by awarding badges to trainers, hosting events to promote uptake of training, and providing support for and guidance to institutions as they support the staff that go on these courses. And all of that is intended to boost capacity. I briefly mentioned incentives already. What we want to do is to develop internationally aligned guidance and support for institutions, again, in support of that community practice. There are resources for institutions themselves to allow them to map their journey along the open research journey, if you like, in terms of a maturity framework and where they are as an institution in terms of the training they offer and the incentives that exist, which includes a self-assessment toolkit and guidance for how to move from one level to another. We already have 14 institutions that have provided case studies in terms of where they are on that open research journey, and twice as many, again, institutions involved in developing an institutional community of practice. And in terms of understanding where we are in terms of open research, we have a survey of 60 institutions that reflect their current practice, and we're linking to a range of other initiatives through Quora, European projects, and US initiatives. So the basic shape of the program is to deliver training through this train the trainer model and to establish incentives that drive the uptake of training and also the uptake of the open research practices themselves, and for institutions to be continually reflecting on where they are in terms of the mix of training and incentives that they offer, so that over time, what we see is an increased uptake of open research practices across the research community, particularly within our partner institutions, but we're also potentially interested in whether any of that benefit bleeds out into non-partner institutions because of that constant flow of researchers from one institution to another. So to monitor open research practices, we are taking a two-pronged approach, and these are effectively the primary outcomes, one more subjective, one more objective in our evaluation program. The first is a survey, a self-report measure of people's engagement with open research practices. And what we're trying to do is to develop an open research prevalence survey that is coordinated with global practice, for example, the UNESCO monitoring framework, but also the other open research surveys that have emerged over the last few years across the sector. So we are having conversations with others who are developing or have developed their own open research survey so that we can align those different surveys to make sure they're capturing the same thing, agreeing which survey teams are going to be involved in that collaborative effort, and then planning for that to be an ongoing process of coordination and alignment so that those surveys that are going out, particularly in other countries, are at least comparable and interoperable. And our first pass at a UK survey is now available as a preprint and is under review as a data note, and the data for that are available. This was very much a pilot exercise from which we learned a number of lessons. It will in part serve as a baseline for our evaluation going forward, but the next iteration of the survey will be refined based on what we learned from that initial exercise. Alongside that survey of open research practices, we're also developing ways of measuring more objective indicators of open research practices with a sub-project that works across 15 institutions and a range of different for-profit and non-profit solution providers that are intended to capture measures of whether or not data are open or fair, whether or not there are data availability statements in published papers or preprints, whether or not there is evidence of pre-registration, and whether or not the credit taxonomy has been used in those published papers. And so what this will hopefully provide us will be a more objective measure of specific open research practices that isn't dependent on people responding to a survey and responding in an accurate way. So the hope is that we will be able to triangulate evidence from these two different data sources to give us a sense of whether or not we are seeing genuine change in open research practice. The indicators are more of a lagging indicator because many of them will only exist at the point where a preprint becomes available or an article is published, whereas uptake of open research practices is a necessary precursor to the availability of those indicators. But given the time available to us over the next 3 or 4 years, we hope that what we initially see as an uptick in open research practices as reflected in the survey will subsequently be reflected in an uptick in open research practice through these more objective indicators. And there has been preliminary work done on this. You may have seen that PLOS, for example, published some of its own preliminary work on open research indicators, and PLOS is one of the solutions providers working with us closely on this pilot. And so what we want to do is ultimately ask the question, has there been an increase in high quality open research practices over the lifetime of the open research program? And that will be through the survey and the indicators. We also want to know whether or not the individual elements of the open research program have met their SMART objectives. So for example, has the train the trainer element of the intervention trained the number of people that we originally intended to, and has that training then been delivered to a larger number of people through the workshops delivered at host institutions? And those individual projects that form the component parts of the overall intervention will also be developing their own project level evaluations. I won't be talking about that in detail today, in part because that's still a work in progress. But for example, if we look at the training, as well as those objective indicators of uptake, there will also potentially be some qualitative work looking at the reasons why people did or did not engage with the training and engage with the workshops when they were delivered and so on, so that we can understand what worked and what didn't work, and in particular understand whether that was different across different institutions, for example, with a different mix of teaching and research intensity and so on. And so these are some of the challenges that we face when we have a complex intervention with multiple component parts being delivered in a way that precludes an experimental design, precludes randomization, and requires us to evaluate the intervention in a pre-post way against a backdrop of an ever-changing landscape when it comes to open research. So how can we determine that any changes in our outcomes in open research practices are indeed related to the intervention or its component parts? How can we measure open research practices? And as I say, we're trying to do that through a combination of survey and more objective indicators. How can we fit all of this together into a coherent framework? And how can we evaluate that change against that ever-changing background landscape of open research? One of the problems that one of the ways in which we're hoping to address some of those challenges is by using multiple statistical approaches to evaluate the outcome. So a straightforward way of doing this would be to adopt the still relatively conventional frequentist approach, where we set up the study, generate the data, in this case, pre and post. The data set that we get is one realization of the potentially infinite number of possible data sets. And we analyze those data and calculate a p-value that tells us the probability of observing that data set given all of the other possible data sets that we could have observed. And we use that to evaluate our hypothesis. The problem with that approach in the context of this evaluation or this intervention is that it makes it very difficult for us to understand which of the different component parts are in fact driving uptake of open research practices. So to give one example, is it the provision of training that drives up open research practices, or is it the establishment of incentives that pulls people towards open research practices, or is it a combination of both? And if it's both, which is having the larger effect? So in order to attempt to understand that, we're going to supplement that conventional analysis with a Bayesian analysis, which, as many of you will know, takes a different approach and assumes that the observed data set is a fixed entity, not a single instance of an infinitely large number of possible data sets. And it's the parameters that vary across different patients, participants, depending on your perspective. This is a methodology that has been developed in the clinical trials context, and which we will be applying in this context, because although it's not a clinical trial, although we're not dealing with patients, structurally, we are treating the open research program as an intervention and looking at its impact on a large number of researchers across the sector. And so what we will be doing here is looking at what we see, the data set, and what we think we know or knew before the experiment began, which are our priors. And anyone familiar with Bayesian analysis will know that. And if we think we don't know anything about, for example, how the different component parts of the intervention may be working or their relative impact, then we can reflect that as well in the priors that we use. And so what we then have is our posterior information, which is a combination of what we knew before and the data that we saw in front of us. And we can then make inferences based on the probability that, for example, the intervention led to a change that we wouldn't otherwise have seen without that intervention. But in terms of the component parts, the fact that we have multiple institutions taking part in the intervention and multiple component parts of that intervention means that we can then look at those two different things in relation to the different indicators, let's say the survey and the open research indicators, but each of those will have component parts around different open research practices, for example, and see whether or not any of the differences in uptake of different interventions across institutions leads to differences in which of those metrics changes in those institutions to help us determine which of those interventions is actually driving change in those different behaviors. And this can get quite granular. So, for example, there might be one institution where nearly all of the trainers went on courses around data sharing, and so the workshops that were delivered were on data sharing, and another institution might send trainers onto ORCID courses only, and therefore the workshops that were delivered were on ORCID only. The reality won't be as extreme as that, but there will be differences in the relative uptake of the different train-the-trainer courses available across different institutions. and therefore differences in the number of people trained in those practices. And if that maps onto differences in the uptake of different metrics of open research practices and those particular open research practices across those institutions, then we can begin to infer which of the interventions were having most of a difference. And you can see that reflected graphically here. So it's that naturally occurring variation that is effectively creating for us a natural experiment, an unbalanced experimental environment, if you like, from which we can make inferences about which elements of the intervention are in fact working. So for each institution, we can use our priors, gather information from other institutions, and tell us how an intervention would have affected the outcomes in those different institutions. So here we have institution 1, which is delivering intervention 1 or one component of our overall intervention. Institution 2, which is delivering 2 interventions. And a simple example of what that might look like is that we can say, well, if the impact in institution 1 was this much, let's move that across to institution 2. What we're left with is then the effect of intervention 2. And we can do that across multiple institutions to gradually compartmentalize the impact of the different constituent parts of our overall intervention. And the network of interventions across the participating institutions and the combination of multiple metrics will give us the granularity, we hope, to allow us to tease apart those different impacts so that we can not only make some claim about the change in open research practices that can be attributed to the overall intervention, but also say something about which constituent parts of that intervention are actually leading to that change or having the greatest impact. So I hope that's been clear. It's a whistle-stop tour through a fairly complex project. It's an ambitious project that's only now starting to ramp up. We've put out our first call for trainers and had a pretty good response to that. The hope is that when we come back in 3 or 4 years' time, we'll be able to say that there was a measurable improvement in or increase in uptake of open research practices across the UK sector, particularly those participating institutions, and hopefully more so in those participating institutions than in non-participating institutions, and also be able to say something about what it was about the intervention that actually led to that change. And if we can do that, then we can move some way towards realizing this aspiration, promoting rigorous, reproducible and transparent research. And if you're interested in finding out more about the program, the head of program, who unfortunately can't join us today, is Neil Jacobs, but we are very happy to answer questions, and thank you for listening. And what I will do is pause briefly in case any of my colleagues on the call, Ruth, Alice or Richard, want to chip in and say that I misrepresented things horribly, but hopefully not. But assuming that they're reasonably happy, and Richard, who is the statistical expert, is smiling, so that's a relief. I'll hand over to Ruth.
Fab, thanks so much, Marcus. So we thought that this would be a good point. Now you've heard all about UKRN and the program itself, whether this is the first time or another time we've come upon it, is to have a bit of feedback from you. So we're going to be using Mentimeter. I'm just going to pop into the chat the website that you need to go to and the code you need to use, but then I will pop and share my screen. But I'm just going to make sure I start to see people going in, because once I share my screen, I won't be able to see the chat. But we just have 3 questions that we thought would be really useful to get your feedback on whilst we have you here, and then we thought we could kind of turn to Q&A and any further questions that come out of that. And if anybody has not used Mentimeter before, it's just a platform that allows us to kind of collect people's quick responses to questions, but also kind of show them all up on the screen at the same time, so we can start to see if kind of common themes or questions or phrases come up at the same time. So it's quite useful to see all in one go. I think I will start showing my screen, and if anyone else sees anything come through on the chat that suggests that people have not been able to get in, then I can reshare. So the first question that we'd be really keen for your thoughts on was around now that you've heard about all of the kind of evaluation measures that we were thinking about using within the ORP, if there are any other measures that we can add. So what could we add to our evaluation measures as they currently exist? So thinking about the ways that we're looking in terms of open research indicators, in terms of the survey, in terms of what we want to gather from the interventions themselves, such as the training, such as the reward and recognition, if there's anything else that came to your mind or from other projects or experiences that you've had could be useful for us to add. And what I will also do is pop that question into the chat in case anybody is having any difficulties accessing Mentimeter, or it's easier to add a response in Zoom or provide a Q&A response, then that would also be great. Interesting first point around the impact on adoption potentially influences the innovation speed. Really interesting. Thanks everyone who's adding at the moment. I'll also leave a bit of a pause as well, because I know it's sometimes difficult to go about putting thoughts together when someone keeps jabbering on. Great. Just going to leave that open for a couple more minutes. Just want to gather some initial thoughts and be able to get through all of our questions so that we have enough time for Q&A and addressing anything else that comes up through these. But interesting to see the responses so far on evaluating behaviour change as an interesting Q&A. I think that maybe we'll come back to that, but I think that that's certainly within the kind of the project level evaluation that we were discussing. Resource capabilities, another really, really good and important one, and definitely something that we can come back to and speak a bit more about. Comparison of intra-institutional as well as multiple institutional, another quite interesting one considering the scale and size of some of the institutions that are part of the program. Surveying attendees at the train the trainer, again, I think we can come back to that, but I think that we can say that that's definitely something that is intended to happen, whether that forms part of the kind of overarching evaluation or the specific evaluations of the projects themselves. And yeah, points about interviewing trainees and trainers. I think that that would definitely form part of the qualitative element that Marcus had outlined that kind of will help with bring further kind of getting into the nuance and complexity that some of these interventions will definitely have above just being able to provide kind of trained trainers to each institution. Fab, yeah, the difference between the effect from the program and any kind of broader effect that is happening in the sector. I think another very interesting and really important one that we've definitely been considering and grappling with. And yeah, another one on resource capabilities, definitely. Yeah, different contexts of research. I think, again, one that we've been considering a lot and definitely starts to come out as you work with more institutions and people with different backgrounds and from different disciplines within those institutions. Defining open data, definitely something that has been discussed, especially in respect to the open research indicators work that's focusing on how that's captured, cross-sector analysis, definitely. And questionnaires and experiences around personality traits of trainers and orcas. Yeah, interesting how the backgrounds play into what could be perceived as the success or impacts of the interventions of the program. These are all really great. Thank you so much, everyone. This is really, really helpful. Definitely touched on some things that we've been already thinking about or discussing, but definitely some points that we'll need to take away and some Q&As that we'll definitely come back to. Okay, fab. Actually, I want to make sure that we get through all the questions with enough time for Q&A. So I'm just going to move us on to the second question that we have. So this should be on the same side. You shouldn't have to go anywhere. But our second question is about kind of what else we could evaluate. So I think some of the things that came up in the question before probably related to this, but now that you've heard about the open research program kind of in the round, is there anything else feels important that we maybe didn't touch on that we were looking at the moment, or could be more relevant as we kind of go through? Obviously that set of train the trainer courses has begun, and that will obviously continue to come out. More people will be trained, so more things may come through as that happens. But is there anything that as we were going through came to mind that we could be looking at? Again, it may also be that we covered those in the first question because we gave a lot of answers to those, which is brilliant. I'll just give one more minute if we feel that we've kind of given all of our responses to the first one, then I'll move on to the final question. Evolution of practice in different disciplines. Yeah. Another interesting one to consider, as you said, as a result of program activities, but probably also linking to the evaluation of the practices of different disciplines that are happening outside of the program, and how we might begin to untangle what is an impact to the program and what is an impact of other broader changes that are happening in the UK landscape and wider. Thank you, that was really useful. Okay, fab. I'm going to move us on to the final question. Well, thank you. Around training and discussion of interaction, data sovereignty issues with open data policies. Another interesting one that we should be considering and looking at. Thank you. Okay, fab. Just to give us, and cost benefit, definitely. And that probably links to the points around resource and assessment, evaluation of resource from the previous question as well. Okay, fab. I'm going to just quickly speed us on to the final question so that we have enough time to sort of come back to the Q&As that have been posed. But our final question is around how long do you think that change in open research practices will take to emerge? With suggesting there 3 years, 5 years or longer, but obviously they're just a guidance. Just interested to hear, especially in the context of what we've just spoken about, how people foresee that change happening and over what time frame. Dependent on discipline. Yeah, institutional change. Small shifts early. Thank you. These are really helpful. And I think, again, something that I think that we've begun to untangle as we get into the sort of meat of the open research program. Capabilities across countries and stakeholders, definitely. Yeah, and the overlapping of influences, I think, is definitely going to be really crucial. And it's something that I think in the open research program, because of those kind of three interventions coming together, and as Marcus said, the different kind of levels of engagement from institutions, from that senior level, from the grassroots level, from the kind of professional services and researcher levels kind of across, will play into how all those kind of influences come together. And getting people to work together, definitely. And the incentives part will be really crucial. Okay, fab. Unless is there anything else in that question? Please, if the meeting will stay open, and I can pop the rest of the questions in the chat. If anybody has anything else, please feel free to add as we sort of move into the Q&A section. But I think, Marcus, I'll copy over the Q&As from the earlier questions into the chat, just so we have them posed. But I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks for all that feedback. So, as Ruth said, and I'll come to Alice and Richard in a moment in case they want to pick up on any themes that emerged there. And Ruth, you may want to pick up on some as well. As Ruth was saying, some of that feedback is going to be very helpful for the individual sub-projects. I think that evaluation of why people engage in research or don't, and how that is patterned across different disciplines, for example, will be very interesting. But that's the kind of thing that will be done at the level of the training sub-project, for example. The overall evaluation project is looking at the intervention as a whole and its component parts and its impact on our primary outcomes. But there is a lot of kind of granular work that we could do within that. I think the idea of an economic evaluation is a really important one. We will have the data that will allow us to do that. That's not formally part of this evaluation project, but that is something that we would come back to, not least because we want to be able to articulate to institutions the cost benefits of, or the benefits of making this business as usual for themselves, but also use that information to inform UKRN's longer term sustainability. And in terms of some of the differences that we expect to see, it's certainly true that STEM disciplines are at a different point in the open research journey to, say, the arts and humanities and perhaps the social sciences. And so we want to see not just whether there are differences in uptake across those different disciplines, but also whether or not different things work or incentivize uptake in those different disciplines. And so there's a lot that we could look at, and some of that will be devolved down to the individual projects. There were some questions in the Q&A that I think have been answered in terms of getting involved. So everything that we do, we're going to be ultimately making openly available, as you might expect. It would be a bit odd if we didn't. So others can then take advantage of the framework that we've developed and improve it and adapt it and so on. If you are based in the UK and your institution is not yet a partner in this, then of course we can help you advocate for joining to your senior management. We certainly will be collecting demographic information, but again, that data will be collected on the trainers, for example, by those that are leading the training sub-project. But we hope to be able to incorporate that into our analysis, at least to be able to see whether or not, for example, the people who are taking up the training are representative of researchers at that institution or not. And that will be an important consideration as well. So I'll stop there, but Alice, Richard, I don't know if you have anything that you would like to add or any themes you'd like to pick up on, and then maybe we can just open up to more questions.
I don't think I've got anything more to kind of grow on what you've already said, but just to kind of articulate that, you know, any analysis I will do, and I'll make it available in a Git repository or something, so people can always see exactly what's done and how, in the kind of good spirit of open research. And I think just to kind of say that, you know, it's the way we plan to do the analysis is something dynamic that kind of grows over time as we get more information. So I think we'd probably start with the kind of macro level, what interventions seem to be working. But as we get more data, we'll be able to go into more granular details. So, you know, it'd be nice to kind of collect the demographic information. So as we progress in the project, we can look at things at a more micro level.
I'm not sure I have much more to add really either. Just to reiterate that the evaluation program, part of the program really is about learning how we can evaluate, using tools to really understand how we've done within the program, but also to develop tools that can go on to be useful for evaluating open research practices in the longer term. So hopefully some of these tools we develop will be useful beyond the lifespan of the program.
There's a question in the chat. Is this work leading towards recommending changes in the ref? If you're not familiar the REF is the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, which comes around every few years, and there's a national level evaluation framework for institutions to determine which institutions are doing the best research effectively and creating the best research environments. This will certainly inform that, in particular, the indicators work that I mentioned, how we can objectively measure uptake of open research practices within an institution. That sort of thing will definitely feed into discussions around the REF. And the REF exercise is run by Research England, who are funding this program. So they're very interested in what we learn through it. And so, although it's not directly linked, it's very sort of adjacent. So there's an interesting question there. And again, if Ruth, Alice, Richard, you want to come in on any of these, then please do pop your hand up and we'll come to you. But there's an interesting question around data sovereignty and open data policies. I think as the open research conversation matures, we are having increasingly interesting conversations around the limits of that and the tensions between, for example, making data openly available versus respecting Indigenous data sovereignty. And that's certainly part of the training. It's not, I would say, a core part, but we have an EDI advisory committee that is advising us on whether or not the training that we are delivering is cognizant of various EDI issues, and each of the different elements of the open research program is completing an EDI impact assessment at the moment that will look at issues of EDI more in relation to the people who are participating in the program, but I think that links to these issues of data sovereignty. And we're working closely with reproducibility networks, particularly in the Global South. We have a Brazilian reproducibility network and an African reproducibility network where these issues are very live. And of course, there is also tension between open research practices and other constraints on that. In the UK, we have what's known as the Trusted Research Agenda, which is about making sure that we protect national security and infrastructure, but so that we don't make research transparent in a way that ultimately could backfire. That's what it boils down to. So there are lots of these interesting tensions emerging, and what we hope to do is, through the training program, introduce those concepts so that people are aware that one shouldn't take an overly simplistic approach to open research and should recognize those tensions and be ultimately as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And I should say, sorry about this, Bill, we have another member of the project team on the call as well, Bill Greenhalgh, who's from the University of Liverpool. And Bill, do feel free to chip in if you have anything you'd like to add to any of the things that we're talking about.
I think you're doing a marvelous job, Marcus.
Thanks, Bill. That's very kind of you. Alice, Ruth, do you want to say anything else on that, on issues of data sovereignty? It's not exactly an EDI issue, but it feels like it's linked to that, or anything about what we're doing around collecting demographics and ensuring that what we do is cognizant of those of the need to take into account those issues.
I think probably not a huge amount more than what you said. I think that we recognize that there are some initial commitments made to EDI when the kind of open research program was imagined in the beginning, and we're just making sure that when we're considering all of these interventions and the way we evaluate them and the way that we work together as a program is considering EDI, because there are obviously also quite a lot of live issues around EDI in the wider academic environment. So just to say that we're really aware of those and that we're making sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that they're considered and anything is addressed and mitigated as it should be.
And there's a question in the Q&A. Alice is typing an answer, but I can come in on that as well. Yes, this is currently a UK project. In fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that still. So the UK has 4 nations within it: England, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And Research England only funds English institutions. The Open Research Programme does include institutions currently in Wales and Scotland, none yet in Northern Ireland, but we'd like that to change. but the funding can only go directly to English institutions. So another part of the naturally occurring variation in the program, if you like, is that some institutions are having to pay for their participation themselves, whereas other institutions are getting funding from Research England to support that. And it's even more complicated because the original partner institutions on the bid have been added to by other institutions within England and beyond that have joined since, and those institutions that have since joined don't get direct funding. And that's, I think, also going to be interesting because it will allow us to see whether or not the engagement of the university and the uptake of the training and all of those kinds of things is contingent on receiving external funding or not. But the short answer to the question is yes, it's only happening in the UK at the moment. But like I say, we plan to make all of what we do and what we learn as openly available as possible so that others, if they want to, can take the framework, the protocol, the survey, and so on, and implement that in their own national or regional context.
And I guess just to add that the UKRN is fostering a lot of relationships with a lot of external international organisations and interacting with, UNESCO, Centre for Open Science, various different international organisations that allow us to kind of get that interpretation of the wider context. So although we're delivering things predominantly within the UK, we're getting inputs from the wider open research context as well.
We're getting quite close to the end of our time. We had an hour allocated to this and we've got a few minutes left. I think we've answered all of the questions in the Q&A. And as I say, there are lots of ways to get in touch. You can get in touch via Twitter or LinkedIn, which are our major social media presences, via Neil as the head of the Open Research Programme. I think any of us on the call today will be happy to field questions directly, and we're easy enough to find through the magic of Google. Other search providers are available. And so if there are no more questions, I'm going to give it a couple of minutes in case anyone does think of one, but equally, people generally don't mind waiting a few minutes back to go and make a hot drink of their choice before their next session or next meeting. I think we very much enjoyed being part of it and being invited. So thank you to the Centre for Open Science for inviting us and hosting us. And thank you all for taking the time to join and listen to what we had to say. We recognise that this is a big and challenging project, and no evaluation is perfect, particularly when you can't wave the magic wand of randomisation. But I think the naturally occurring variation will be quite powerful. And Richard has promised us he can do clever things to allow us to make stronger inferences than we otherwise might. So hopefully we'll be able to report back in 3 or so years and say that good things happened in the UK as a result of this. But our hope is that what we do, others can learn from and adapt. And so if you do want to be involved in that capacity, then please do get in touch.